So I want to give you a fair warning that today's story is not inspirational. It does not have a happy ending. Actually, when I first read about it about a year ago, it kind of had me like circling the pit of despair. So if you're anywhere near the pit of despair, maybe skip this video. Okay? Alright, so we're going to start this story. Actually, the beginning of the story goes all the way back to like the Industrial Revolution. You could probably track it back to like the founding fathers, honestly. But for the sake of today's story, we're going to start in the mid-1950s in the United States. So we're doing our second Red Scare, and it's peak McCarthyism within the United States. And the American people are pretty much focused on like the drama in Hollywood and Washington, D.C., and like, is my neighbor a communist? But meanwhile, there are other groups in the United States who are actually extremely concerned about what's going on externally. And I don't mean in Russia, and I don't mean in China. American labor leaders, primarily when I say American labor leaders in the story, I mean the heads of the AFL-CIO, were very, very concerned about what unions were doing across the globe, in the global south particularly. They were worried that their rank and file members would see leftist unions and leftist political movements were getting more for their workers than they could ever get with the business unionism of the United States. And maybe they might start organizing in other ways, and maybe they might stop paying their dues. Okay? Now, we have our wealthy business owners in the United States. They would like to maybe invest abroad. They would like to have factories in other countries, third world countries, might say. They would like some workers to exploit, to be honest, because the American labor movement's doing all right, and it's not so easy to exploit American workers right now. And then we have the Central Intelligence Agency, and they were pretty much worried that the leftist unions and political movements were going to, turn all the countries into commies, I guess. And honestly, all of these three groups, they came to like the same conclusion, basically. Like, we have to act now because these left-oriented unions are like literally capable of bringing about like a proletarian revolution across the globe, like domino effect, and we have to stop it now. And so to prevent this from happening, they were like, the wealthy business leaders were like, we need to work with someone who knows something about unions to do something about these unions. And the unions were like, we need to work with somebody who can get us into these countries and also maybe have some money. And so the wealthiest corporation owners in the United States, the CIA and the AFL-CIO, found themselves very strange bedfellows, right? Like, one would really hope that the AFL-CIO, the labor leaders, would be like, even like a little bit hesitant to interfere with workers in other countries or to work against workers in other countries, right? Like, you would think if I say like AFL-CIO, corporation owners, and CIA, like one of these is not like the other, right? Wrong? In all truth, like the AFL-CIO is like, honestly, the primary authority on working against communism and leftist movements and socialists. They purged them from their own ranks. So how hard could it be to do it in other countries, right? And I mean, honestly, American labor leaders have been working to undermine leftist movements since before the CIA was even established. So they really did not need any convincing. In fact, like, the idea for what would later become the American Institute for Labor Development, it was first proposed, and this is one of the few people that I name and shame in this story, right? It was proposed by the Communication Workers of America President Joseph Byrne at the time. He held a seat on the AFL-CIO Executive Council, and this was his grand idea. So in 1962, the American Institute for Labor Development went into operation, called the AIFLD, and basically the AFL-CIO and the CIA were like locked in, right? But the businessmen were like, I don't know if we like want to work with unions, like for real. We don't know if we trust you. So they said, come on, like CEO and chairman of Pan American Airways, Gulf Oil, Johnson & Johnson International, literally, come join the board of trustees of the AIFLD. And the corporations were like, I mean, yeah, I guess. So the fact that they agreed to like be a part of the AIFLD, that like just demonstrates to you how certain they were that whatever the AFL-CIO was going to do with the unions was going to be in their benefit. Which is like not encouraging to our story, right? So the mission, they have their mission and the mission is clear. Rather than allow the working classes of the world to mount an effective challenge by radicalizing workers and fueling leftist political movements, unions would need to be turned into like containment instruments, basically. Let's strangle the revolutionary potential of the working class using their own unions against them. So the AIFLD was almost exclusively funded by USAID. We still hear about them, right? They were big controversy at the beginning of this year with them losing a lot of their grant funding. So USAID funded the AIFLD to the tune of like several $millions per year those first years, which is a lot of money in the early 1960s and even more money in the early 1960s in undeveloped countries, right? So the first like target was South America and Mexico, and they were really coordinating with the U.S. foreign policy apparatus because they were like, the U.S. foreign policy apparatus was like looking at Cuba and was like, well, we have to do something immediately. So that was like a heavy focus, but they were not the only ones. In Asia, we had the Asian American Free Labor Institute, AAFLI, that was founded in 1968. And labor scholars agree that like the trade union practices and like the labor laws in countries like South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Malaysia, and even like India are the result of American manipulations in the trade unions rather than any of the activities of the local workers. So like when we look at the American labor movement and we look at like American labor laws and like OSHA standards, we say like every rule was won in blood, right, by American workers. Most rules in like these countries were like picked by the business owners and people working against the workers. But the workers thought that they were the ones advocating for it, is like the real like messed up thing. And then the third institute, like the third kind of leg of the like AIFLD, was the African Labor College. This is like the shadiest, probably most horrifying one. And I say probably most horrifying because it's incredibly difficult to find information about the African Labor College. We know that it was headed up by Irving Brown, who was the AFL-CIO envoy to Europe before taking this position. We know that they worked closely with the French government, especially in the countries that had recently been colonies of France. We know that somehow a lot of African countries stayed out of the Soviet orbit. We know that they were extremely destabilized. We know that working movements in Africa to this day in a lot of countries are struggling. What we don't know are the specifics, because where the AIFLD kept careful documentation of its activities in South America and Mexico and Asia, we can't find these documents about what happened in African countries. I'm sure like it's on my list of things to research. And I think I saw like one book that's like in print that I can like order about this. So like people have looked into it. Like it's not like a dark hole, but like it's much harder to find information about this. Like I can't even find the CIA documents about the activities in South America and Asia, but not about what happened in African countries. So that's like terrifying. I can only assume it's just so horrifying that the repercussions for the information becoming well known would be off the charts. Okay. Like what the heck, right? Okay. So anyways, So basically, if we look at all these as a whole, like when we zoom out, you can see that the AIFLD basically like fine-tuned the mechanisms for building like an enemy on the inside of a country. They weaponized, ethnic, religious, and political pretexts to divide and conquer the proletariat in like countries around the globe. Like it's fine-tuned and then maybe used at home. That's just a speculation on my part. But the Institute's main activity in the 60s and 70s was labor education. Particularly, what they were doing was training participants on how to combat left-wing influences in their respective unions. So trainees who were considered to have exceptional potential, goodness only knows what the CIA considers exceptional potential for this kind of activity, they would be brought to a facility in Virginia for a 3-month residential intensive course taught by CIA officials and, union organizers from the AFL-CIO. I've seen it called like 3 months of brainwashing by some authors. Other people are like, they were just, teaching them about business unionism and like the wonders of capitalism. So I'm sure the truth is somewhere in the middle. And then they would be sent back to their home countries with stipends, basically, to fund their anti-leftist organizing efforts. Some of like the more like disgusting things that were done was the Institute weaponized U.S. foreign aid. For example, so you see like a line item in USAID's budget, right? And it would say like housing development projects. Now, if you or I like saw that, or like someone who was doing like maybe an audit or anything, we would be like, oh wow, that's like really amazing that like American labor unions are working to like help workers in other countries build housing. That's like, wow, like sainthood, What was actually happening was that these funds were being used to build housing for workers, yes, but you could only be like eligible for that housing if you would leave your union or your democratic organization, basically spurn the people that you had organized with before and join a brand new shiny anti-communist union. And of course, you need to apply for the housing. And when you apply for the housing, if you could fill out like this really long document that lists like everything you've ever done, and then like everybody in your union, and like everybody they've ever met, can you just let us know what are their feelings on communism, and like how do they feel about like, have they ever said anything like eat the rich, or like have they ever said like the word proletariat? Like, is that something that you guys are talking about? Like, just let us know, right? Just write it down. And like, I'm not joking, that's true. And then that information was supplied to the CIA. And like, it sounds horrible, right? Like neighbors informing on neighbors and giving it to the CIA. But they did not know that this information, to this day, they do not know that this information is like being funneled to the CIA, okay? Like, let's put ourselves in the shoes of a worker in, say, Guyana in 1960, okay? I have lived in this town, this small town, my whole life with Joe. I grew up with Joe. I work in this like factory, this oil refinery. It's like me and Joe, right? Not like we're best friends, you know what I mean? Like, it's someone you know. And like trade unions are like super building momentum in the area, and it's like a big deal. Joe goes away for 3 months. Now, he might have said he was going to do training for, union organizing, or he might have said he was going to visit a family member in a different state or city, whatever. Joe comes back. Joe, in a few months, has all these new ideas about how the union should be organized, and he has all this new, somehow, funding, but like, let's not look too closely into that, right? He has all this new, like, potential, these new great things that like he's offering to me if I like am swayed to his side. Like, wow, like our grassroots communist union isn't building like free housing, like they're not providing healthcare, like they don't have the funds for that. So like maybe this other like business friendly union is better. And like honestly, I could really use a house. Who couldn't use a free house? Like, I'm making like 2 cents a day. So like, let me just try it out, right? And I'll like fill out this paperwork because it's just going to Joe. Like, I know Joe. What's that going to do? Like, he's obviously just trying to organize, the working class. And yeah, maybe this is for the best. So they didn't know they were being manipulated and organized, not by their working class comrades, but by the CIA. So then the Institute also, they offered incentives to workers and trade unionists once they got back home, because I'm certain that it was not out of the realm of possibility that people would come back home from this 3-month training course and be like, I mean, okay, that was great and all, and like probably like kind of stressful, and like America's great, but like, why would I like come back here and like actively work against my own material interests and like sabotage my neighbors? Like, that would be weird. No, they didn't want that to happen, so they continued to basically offer like abundant incentives to their trainees and people who are working with their trainees and people who are willing to become anti-communist and vocally anti-left-wing. They would do scholarships and funding for schools. They would pave the way for people to go to school in the United States, relatives, friends. They would make sure that there was maybe positions open at U.S. embassies in these countries, or opportunities for favors or loans for, union members. And this would enable like their trainees to gain higher positions in their unions, in their communities, in their local governments, to become like business leaders and thought leaders, academics, media personalities. Like, if you go to a training when you're 19, you have your whole life ahead of you and your whole career. But in exchange for all these favors, the trainees basically served as part of a wide network of contacts. So they are like at all levels of society. They have infiltrated like all the unions, all of the community centers, like all levels of government. For example, when the AFLD was like doing the coup in Brazil in the 60s, they almost got caught because there was like an inquisition into like where all this funding was coming from. I guess there's like a panel, I think it's like 9, a panel of 9 was like doing the government investigation. But they like got off scot-free because 5 of the 9 people who were tasked with doing the investigation were already on the CIA's payroll. Perfect, right? They really headed it off. So, like, I mean, and that network of people at every strata of society, like I said before, enabled the CIA to gather information on the global labor movement. So, like, to this day, like, the 60s were not that long ago. And this didn't stop being done so blatantly until the 80s. So to this day, like, there are rank and file union members out there working, like, side by side with people who are either actual trainees of AFLD or have been influenced by them and they don't know. Or maybe they have an inkling, But, like, to this day, that influence is still felt, and, like, you can see it. You can see it. Like, once you know this, once you can look at things through this lens of, like, oh, like, the unions and, like, the community centers and, like, every layer of society was infiltrated by people who went to a 3-month intensive training course in Virginia with the CIA, you can see, like, all of a sudden it makes sense why people in Brazil, like, turned on their democratically elected leader who they were, like, super excited about and who was, like, elected on a mandate from the people, right? All of a sudden you can see why it's so easy to overthrow governments, because governments that are doing good things for their people. Because all of a sudden you're like, oh, it wasn't organic. Like, the unrest in the streets is not unrest in the streets. It's being quite precisely organized and, like, done by, like, a puppet master, which is the CIA. I wonder if the CIA is going to watch this video, because I've said them a lot. Look, it's not my fault, okay? It's not my fault that you are a horrible. Anyways, okay. And then in the 1980s, the 3 different organizations in Asia, Africa, and South America, and Mexico, they basically consolidated into the American Center for International Labor Solidarity, which received its funding from, you guessed it, the U.S. National Endowment for Humanities, But also, a large chunk of their funding came from corporations with heavy investments abroad. Examples include United Fruit Company, Standard Oil, and Shell Oil. Why would they be funding a labor organization? You know? Why? That's like a question that we might ask ourselves. Just like a standard person, if you saw a labor organization was being funded by Shell Oil, you'd be like, why? That doesn't even make any sense. Okay. But then in the early 90s, there was kind of like a big expose of what the AIFLD had done, mostly in South America, mostly because Bill Clinton tried to appoint a ambassador to Guyana, and the person that he was going to appoint as ambassador to Guyana had been working for the AIFLD in Guyana in the 60s to literally topple the government of the man who was the current president of Guyana when he was sending the ambassador 30 years later, and the president of Guyana was like, I'm sorry, Bill Clinton, what the hell are you doing? And Bill Clinton was like, I literally didn't know, I'm so sorry. And then, like, a lot of information came out from the CIA because they, like, were made to release the documents, and there was a whole, like, investigation. Okay, so all that to say that, like, the American Center for International Labor Solidarity kind of has a tarnished name, and it kind of went quiet, right? And then in 1997, we have something called the Solidarity Center, and this is founded by the AFL-CIO. Founded by the AFL-CIO. So according to the current day website, like I literally just looked today, it says the Solidarity Center is an independent, non-profit organization. We are funded by a wide range of public and private resources and operate with a single mission to help workers secure fair wages and a voice on the job and in society. Wherever workers are silenced, mistreated, or denied their rights, we stand with them. Because when workers have the power to improve their own lives, democracy is stronger and economies grow. I'm sure that they have like completely reformed their ways and are now only working for the good of workers in the international community. Right? Wrong. Just a few years ago, well, I don't know how long, a few years ago feels like not. It was in the 2000s. There was like a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request, and we have a bunch of documents that are basically grant applications to NED, which is the National Endowment for Humanities, right? And one of them basically details that the Solidarity Center needs money because they need to go down to Venezuela and make sure that their unions focus on defending their contracts and defending their right to organize and their labor rights so that they do not become distracted by leftist influences. So basically, the Solidarity Center would like some U.S. government money to make sure that the workers in Venezuela are so distracted by having to fight to defend their contracts with these major corporations that they don't have time or like energy to organize, right? Because we would like to maybe do like another coup in Venezuela in the early 2000s. Maybe we did that. Maybe. So maybe that's why we would like to do that. Yeah. I don't know. So, yeah. You know, and then I would like to also like leave you with one last little thought, and that is that when the AIFLD or its descendants, the Solidarity Center, when they kneecap international workers and their organizing efforts, they leave them open to exploitation by international companies, right? These giant corporations can now pay them absolutely nothing, and bring their giant factories over there, and they don't have any regulations because now the working class has to beg for scraps because the working class organized themselves from nothing, came to the point where they almost had like a government and a country that was going to be for the workers, and then they were systematically crushed from within, toppled, just smashed to nothing, right? So now we've got these international corporations. Look at this great place where we can take all of our factories out of the United States and go put them in these countries and pay them nothing and like destroy their environments because they don't have any like negotiating power, bargaining power, any power at all. So what does that do to the American labor movement then? Now we have like no ability to negotiate. Now we have an entire class of workers abroad who can be pitted against us when we are trying to get jobs, when we are trying to negotiate for higher wages. Now, American workers and workers in other countries have to fight each other for work instead of looking at the, I don't know, evil freaking companies and government and bureaucrats who are literally manipulating and playing puppet master to workers in every corner of the globe, including the United States. That sounds dramatic, right? But like, I'll leave you with a quote, okay? This is a quote from one of the people one of the CIA agents who was training people at the Institute and who also like worked on the ground in South America during some of the more historical coups. He said, and this is part of like a living, I don't know what it's called, like when they interview people because they want to preserve the memories because they're like proud of their work, like a history, verbal history, oral history. There you go. He said, sometimes we admittedly face conflicting interests. Like, are we actually helping the interests of American workers when we assist American firms investing abroad? On issues like that, I'm happy to let others decide, and I'll just push for whatever policy is approved. So they knew. They knew in the 1960s that like diverting the leftist unions was like working actively against American workers as well. If you guys are more interested in like more specifics, like how the CIA orchestrated one of the longest, most successful general strikes in the world in Guyana, or how they did a complete coup in Brazil, or how they tried to completely derail the work that was being done by the communists in Kerala, India, which is still to this day going on. They did not succeed. Or even, how they did a little shifty thing during the coup in Iran. If you're interested in any of that, let me know. Those are all stories that I would love to tell because I've done like way too much research on way too many things because I am weird. People hate these long videos actually. So if you made it this far, you've like really committed. So